From the dark, they came.
There have been many people over the years who have looked at Dark Souls from a critical point of view. A multitude of different reviewers have given their thoughts on what makes Dark Souls, quite literally, a genre-defining game. A success of such magnitude that every game that came after could only hope to be held in comparison to its monumental achievements. The eponymous It's Like Dark Souls became the ultimate compliment, an instantaneous appraisal of a game's worth that still persists to this day. Regardless of style, mechanics, or even genre, Dark Souls contained innate wisdom to pass on. It was the ideal example of a game. However, as someone who had never played Dark Souls until the middle of July 2021, I hadn't held that perspective on the game. Of course, I was aware of its influence, but I'd only heard about the game's brutal difficulty, the largest and seemingly most important aspect of its allure to my friends, in the later months of 2011. Now that I've finished the game a few times myself, I wanted to do a deep dive on how Dark Souls succeeds and fails, and to see whether it can still live up to its towering legacy today. So I am PolarBear084, and this is a latecomer's critique on how Dark Souls lands, over a decade after launch. Everyone knows what Dark Souls is. Even people that have never seen or touched the game know that it is brutally difficult and completely unforgiving. They know that the bosses will break your spirit, and that even regular enemies are incredibly hard, that you will die hundreds of times in your first playthrough, and that you can only beat the game if you, yourself, improve. Except it's a little more complicated than that. When I was getting ready to play through this game for the first time, I was surprised at just how few expectations I actually had. I'd heard people discuss it ad nauseum, talking at length about the bosses they'd gotten stuck on, the regions they'd found difficult, or how they'd become so frustrated with their lack of progress at some point or another that they had dropped the game completely, only to return months later and breeze through that section first try. And yet, despite hearing all of this, I hadn't the faintest clue what I was signing myself up for. My naive assumption was that it would be an episodic boss rush, Mega Man style, that would have you running around a fairly bare-bones level, churning your way through hordes of fodder, before finally reaching an opponent worthy of your time. And you know what? If you only look at the second half of the game, I was kind of right. But as I fought through the world of Lordran and found myself lost within its sunken caverns, twisting streets, and gloomy passages, I realized something that nobody had really prepared me for. While Dark Souls may be an action-adventure game, it is far stronger when the focus is on one half of that genre than the other, and is actually more of an adventure game than anyone has given it credit. In fact, I had a much better time with it when the adventure was the focus in the first half of the game than I did when the action was the focus in the second half. To explain why, we'll have to break down Dark Souls into its component parts and figure out what really makes it work.
Forgive me. I really should calm down.
We can split Dark Souls into 4 separate layers: exploration, combat, environment, and world design. These layers control every aspect of the game and feed into each other, looping between themselves to create the intricate gameplay that we become familiar with. Walk around and kill things. Exploration is the most important of these four, and the main way you progress throughout the game, which might sound strange upon first hearing it. It is true that you progress to new areas by defeating bosses and collecting their souls, but it is by exploring these areas that you find bosses to defeat, new equipment to use, and bonfires to rest at. That is not to say that exploration is where the main element of difficulty arises in Dark Souls, but it is the only layer that impacts all the others in a meaningful way. It is the core of the game, the engine, that allows all of the other layers to function. But we'll get into that more later. Combat is the layer that players directly interact with most often throughout the game, and generates some of the difficulty that people remember and talk excitedly about with their friends. There's a surprising amount of depth to how you can approach the myriad enemies that you'll encounter throughout Lordran. You can block, parry, have 3 types of rolls, slow, normal, and fast, and 2 wield styles. You also have heavy attacks, light attacks, backstabs and ripostes, and 16 types of weapons, all with different attack styles. Oh, and the bow, I guess. However, it's not this huge variety of weapons and fighting styles that actually creates the depth to encounters. There could be 100 more weapon types, or a grand total of 3 that you're allowed to use, without impacting the gameplay that massively. No, the main backbone of Dark Souls combat is the idea of flow. Your attacks and movements are designed to give you a feeling of rhythm, with you darting in to deal damage before dodging away from retaliation. On the other hand, enemies are designed to intentionally break that rhythm. They're difficult to stagger, frequently attacking groups, and each creature has its own patterns to memorize and keep track of. All of which very rarely allows you to fight exactly how you want. You're forced to always maintain close awareness of your surroundings, keep in mind what your foes are capable of, and work within those limitations. This paradigm works because both player and enemy are kept on relatively even footing, with the occasional exception. But when they go against this paradigm, the combat breaks down completely. Environment is the overall design of the game from a mechanical perspective, and encompasses a lot of things that people tend to overlook when talking about where the difficulty in Dark Souls is generated. How levels are laid out, enemy position and composition, shortcuts, bonfire positioning, where equipment is hidden. All of this affects how you explore the game, and how you fight. There's also the matter of progression. While the game does leverage RPG elements like levels and stat increases, the player's ability to progress through the game is restricted in the same way as an MMO. Stronger, more aggressive enemies make exploring certain areas difficult until you've improved at the game's combat, or obtained better gear. Finally, there's the smallest layer of the game, world design, which encompasses the presentation, aesthetic, and lore of Dark Souls and the world of Lordran. The dark, oppressive atmosphere that lingers everywhere, armored undead and crumbling structures, the giant behemoths, dragons and hydras, the endless sprawling cathedrals of Anor Londo. All of this seeks to instill a sense of dread and wonder in the player, forever pushing them cautiously onwards, willing to fight, so they may continue exploring this strange and terrifying land. I've marked this as the smallest layer for a few reasons, the greatest of which is that the lore and story of the game are largely a backdrop, an excuse for the game's exploration and action, and almost never directly impacts your path through the game. It is also largely hidden from the player, only told through cryptic messages with NPCs or by observing the environment. There are lore messages attached to some items, but they're so hard to keep track of, having to go to each item individually to read the information, and with no way of following along with what relates to what, that they might as well not exist for most players. These 4 layers, with exploration at the heart, dominate everything you do in Dark Souls, from the Asylum to the Kiln of the First Flame. The game is constantly pushing forwards, encouraging you to adventure in the vast world before you and overcome the challenges that seek to hold you back. They are the core of the game, encompassing everything that makes it iconic and everything that hasn't withstood the test of time. Let's start with the former. I'm going to start off with a statement that might sound odd at first, but I promise it will make sense. Dark Souls is like Mario 64. Yes, that Mario 64. Okay, hear me out though. In Mario, you start out in a largely docile area, where you can experiment with your abilities free of any pressures or objectives. Some hints are available in the world as to how to control your character if you stop to read the signs, and you'll quickly come across your first level, as there's really only one path forward you can take. As you step into the level, you are confronted with your first challenge: defeat the boss. To get there, you have to take a winding path littered with more signs and a small amount of enemies and challenges to lightly test your skills. Eventually, you reach the boss, and after a bit of a struggle, you emerge victorious and are given the means to move forward into the rest of the game. Pretty similar if you ask me. Once you've gotten through the tutorial, you settle into the main gameplay loop. You start in a safe zone and step out of it into the level, pushing through waves of platforming, enemies, exploration, and boss fights to reach your next objective. If you die, you get thrown back to the safe zone to try again, and the level resets. But the similarities continue. Firelink Shrine is Peach's castle, the Lords and the lead up to them are the Bowser fights, and Blighttown is basically the underground caverns. There's even an area in Anor Londo that you can only get to by going through a painting. And if you're still not convinced that Mario 64 is Dark Souls' long-lost cousin, just replace the souls you earn when killing bosses with a star, and you'll start to see what I'm talking about.
Here we go! Brilliant, right? What? What are you looking at?
Okay, so maybe I am being a little facetious here. It's not like Mario and Dark Souls are even in the same genre, or utilize the same mechanics for the majority of their runtimes. But the reason that I'm comparing these two great games is not just because there's a painting in Anor Londo, and they both made their respective genres household names, 3D platformers, and Souls-like games, but also because their gameplay loops, the engines that push you further into each, are incredibly well done. Take Undead Burg as an example of this, the first real location you can explore in the game. You can break up the area by the different paths you can take from bonfires, those that lead to other bonfires, those that either loop back on themselves by the way of shortcuts or result in a dead end. Each path represents a level, a set selection of challenges and enemies that you need to overcome to be able to unlock the next boss, the next bonfire, and the next level. Looking at the game from this point of view, the importance of exploration starts to become apparent. There are no signposts to guide the player along, no map to consult and fill in either. Your ability to progress is purely tied to how competently you can explore and understand this unknown terrain. Enemies frequently attempt to ambush and overwhelm, and outside of boss fights, there's little in the way of a soundtrack to distract from the world you find yourself thrust into. All of this encourages the player to pay attention to the landmarks around them and see what's out of place. To hear the clacking of a concealed undead's armor, a hidden basilisk's ragged breaths. To live and breathe the world of Lordran as you adventure within it. To navigate your way through the twists and turns to the next area of interest. There are other benefits to designing the game this way, as it breaks up large, insurmountable tasks into smaller trials that you can overcome. Instead of having to make it from Firelink Shrine into the aqueduct through the sprawling streets and rooftops, up the tower and across the ramparts to the Taurus Demon, there's a bonfire halfway, giving you a checkpoint to tackle the bomb-throwing undead. And because resting or respawning at a bonfire also revives pretty much every enemy that you've killed, you're given the same level of challenge on each attempt. This makes it possible to understand what the game is asking of you at each step, and figure out a way to achieve it. With each attempt at the level, you can experiment with different approaches to find out what works, what doesn't, and start to notice that challenges that were once almost impossible have become manageable. You can physically see your progress as you get further into the level, closer to the next bonfire, take more health from the next boss. And when you finally do overcome it, you feel like you've achieved something incredible. There is another thing that Dark Souls uses to its advantage during this repeated loop of exploration, combat, and death. Shortcuts. Frequently throughout the game, shortcuts are used as a reward for those that pay close attention to the world around them, and explore every nook and cranny that the game offers up. As early as the Asylum, shortcuts are highlighted as a way of making the brutal world of Lordran a little more forgiving, allowing you to reuse the courtyard bonfire so you can skip half the detour if you die. In fact, this is a neat trick that the game does frequently, reusing a bonfire that you've already found via shortcuts to draw the world together. It compacts the area, and as your knowledge of the world grows, this compacts it further still, until they start to feel like these complex, dense locations while still being easy to navigate at the same time. But shortcuts aren't only a reward. Finding a path to an area that you last saw 3 hours ago, before you descended into Blighttown and fought your way through swamp, poison and brimstone, makes you exclaim aloud, "Wait, I know where this is." They interconnect the world, bringing it to life, as you begin to realize how the different regions weave together. There are multiple moments like this: the elevator in the parish chapel that descends right into Firelink, the way Blighttown can also take you right back to Firelink, or Darkroot Basin if you're blind like me and missed the elevator, or how Anor Londo and New Londo ruins open up multiple times as you explore them, changing their respective landscapes considerably during your time adventuring there. And towards the end of the game, you really start to think of yourself as a master of this realm, as you know every hallway, every landmark, and most of Lordran's secrets. This brings us to the other reason that Mario 64 and Dark Souls are distant relatives: their use of a hybrid of open and linear worlds. They both support each other, leaning on the strengths of each system and fixing most of the weaknesses. Take an open world game like Skyrim, for example, originally released November 11th, 2011, although it's been re-released more than the Bible at this point. You start at one location, the ruined fortress of Helgen, and from there, the entire world is yours for the taking. You are nudged towards Riverwood, but in reality, you can walk in a largely straight line in any direction, and you will find dungeons, landmarks, and challenges to tackle. You can explore the world in pretty much any order, and from any area. Honestly, to this day, having bought the game on 3 different systems with a total playtime in the many hundreds of hours, I still have not finished the story. That's the downside of a game that's too open, too freeing. There's little incentive to do one thing over another, and while this freedom is very enjoyable, it's easy to miss interesting areas and quest lines altogether. And sometimes, the sheer number of things you can do leaves you feeling overwhelmed. Contrast this with more linear games, like the Call of Duty franchise. Let's say Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, as that was also released in November of 2011. Narrow corridors keep you focused on the challenge in front of you, and when these corridors open up, it's usually to showcase an arena or shooting gallery that provides a milestone event or set piece for the level. There's no room for exploration or adventure. These are stripped away to allow you to focus on a few polished mechanics. However, this can start to feel repetitive. That, combined with an inability to really experiment or approach these challenges that creatively, can make these typically shorter experiences. There's only so many combinations of hallway, street, and courtyard shootouts you can do against somewhat incompetent AI before you start getting bored. Dark Souls, however, bridges the gap between these two playstyles masterfully. You have a huge world to explore, with multiple diverse regions and themes, enemies and bosses. The winding, narrow streets of Undeadburg with its shambling hollows. The dank, cramped catacombs of the Tomb of Giants with its hulking, skeletal beasts lurking in the dark. The creaking, fractured framework suspended over the yawning chasm of Blighttown, skulking residents equipped with poison blow darts shooting at you out of the gloom. And the bright enormity of Anor Londo, its towering cathedrals and looming, statuesque bodyguards. These areas all feel completely distinct from one another, without feeling out of place, and offer myriad paths and locations to explore, and often get lost within them. Actually exploring them, however, is not overwhelming, as they're broken down into the levels I mentioned earlier. Even while you are thrown into these beautifully haunting regions that seem to stretch from one horizon to the other, you're given only a couple of paths to take at any one point. You have an enormous open world that blends almost seamlessly together, interconnected with the set pathways and structure of a more linear title. Narrow passageways force you into close quarters with lesser enemies, making it easy to get overwhelmed and hard to get away without dealing with them. They attack in greater numbers and varied compositions, making these relatively weak enemies more of a challenge. Bosses are typically fought in more open arenas, Gaping Dragon, Bell Gargoyles, and the Four Kings, to name a few. And outside of Firelink Shrine and the magnificent Ash Lake, they are the few instances that the game actually utilizes a soundtrack, which allows you to fully appreciate the majesty and spectacle of these intimidating foes. It also makes these bosses more of a rewarding event, as they typically mark the end of one area of the game and the beginning of another. The restrictions that these pathways and corridors put upon the player are also useful when looking at level design. Knowing where someone can approach a group of enemies from and knowing roughly what they'll have been through to get there means you can tailor the encounter to where they are in the game and what equipment they may have. You can use this knowledge to make an encounter fair, providing the player with enemy types and compositions that they will find challenging, but not impossible. You can also use this to discourage a player from exploring a pathway at a certain point in the game, by setting them up for failure, having enemies with more health or damage output than they could reasonably handle. For those who watched my first playthrough of this game, yes, I am talking about the graveyard. Why do you ask?
I just want to talk.
So maybe now you're starting to see just how much of what Dark Souls does well is built off of exploration and the elements that spring from it. However, that's not the whole story. Combat. The other side of this coin. The loudest, most memorable, and brutally painful system that Dark Souls employs. While it seems simple on the surface, the limited options reinforce the need for precision, patience, and understanding your foe. Combat will usually progress like this. You approach a new unit slowly at first, cautious of what they may be capable of. You're unsure of how they can move, the attacks they may have access to, the items they're hiding up their sleeves. After taking a couple of swings, you feel like you're starting to understand how they fight. And then you die. As you fight each enemy again and again, you gain confidence, as they lose this ability to surprise you. You understand their attack patterns, how to counteract them, and how to take advantage of their openings. On my second playthrough that I did for this video, I realized just how slow the hollow enemies are and how easy it is to circle around them and backstab them, no matter how many of them there may be. I was also surprised at just how much I could remember about all of the rank and file in Undead Burg, Deeproot Forest, and beyond. The game had trained me to pay such close attention to all of these creatures that they are now permanently ingrained in my mind. Every enemy is such a serious threat that you cannot afford to ignore them. You have to learn and understand what they're capable of to be able to handle them efficiently and not fall victim to their more ferocious attacks or hidden tricks. And at least for me, it was the first time I fought a Black Knight and knew what I wanted to do at each step of the fight that I started to notice how much I had actually progressed. But it was only towards the end of the game that I felt that I had started to master it. Mastery of the combat system is a unique blend, 1 part knowledge, 1 part execution, and 2 parts patience. There's an inescapable flow to how combat progresses, and attempting to break out of that flow will invariably get you killed. Each movement your enemy makes provides a certain opening, but in exactly the same way, each action you take will leave you open as well. This is where knowledge of your enemy makes all the difference, as you know what moves will be too risky and what will not give them time to counterattack. This sweeping attack with a 2-handed longsword works great against a horde of weaker hollows, for example, but against a bolder knight would be a death sentence. Similarly, the quick stabs of a rapier are fantastic in a one-on-one duel, yet grossly ineffective when dealing with more than a couple of enemies. I've heard combat in Dark Souls compared to a rhythm game, with your foe providing the prompts that you have to respond to quickly enough, or you die. However, I'm not entirely sure that that's correct. in my opinion, it's more strategic than that, closer to a fencing match or a competition between two martial artists than a round of DDR. You are actively rewarded for going on the offensive, creating your own openings to deal damage, and disrupting your opponent's intended attack pattern. You could wait for a shielded hollow soldier to swing at you so that you can attack freely, for example, or you can just kick its shield, knock it off balance, and run it through. Attempting to deal with the multi-hit flailing nonsense that the bloatheads of Ulasil can throw at you will decimate your stamina if you try to block through it. But trying to dodge will see you rolling through the township like a very well-dressed tumbleweed. Alternatively, you can just cut them down before they even have the chance to get going. The same is even true against bosses, no matter how large or fast they may be. The gaping dragon that guards the key to Blighttown, seriously, he was trying to do us all a favor if we're being honest, has a surprising amount of mobility and large AoE attacks that shuts down any attempt to fight it face to teeth. However, you can run around to its tail and wail away without a care in the world, as most of the dragon's attacks are front-facing, aside from an easy-to-avoid tail whip. You can also try to bait out the charge attack to give you a lot of time to get damage in, near or from afar, or chip away at it in the downtime after the repositioning jump that it does. There are many different openings for the many different enemies that are in Dark Souls, but to me, it's clear that From Software wanted you to be an active participant in the fight. Reacting to enemies' attacks and movements is definitely a large part of how combat operates, but taking advantage of your enemy's weaknesses to turn the tide of battle in your favor is almost certainly just as important. In fact, if you haven't played the game since originally beating it, I would highly recommend going back into New Game Plus and seeing just how much more confident you are in the starting areas. Where before you were probably waiting for a large window of opportunity before even thinking of striking back, I guarantee now you'll have a more aggressive and assertive fighting style. You are also frequently pitted against multiple enemies, where you have to prioritize your targets and pick them off one by one, paying attention to the movements of each opponent and positioning yourself so that you do not get swarmed. The game is constantly asking you to evaluate your surroundings, act, and then evaluate again, and this is where the fabled difficulty comes in. You're given so much information to take in, to react to, and plan for in such a short space of time, and if you fail to do so correctly, you die. The reason why this works so well is because of what I'm going to call the fairness of these encounters, which must sound a bit odd. How exactly is fighting two fire-breathing gargoyles, lizards that can turn you to stone, or a 12-headed hydra fair? Well, that might be because I'm not using the traditional meaning of fairness. In fact, trust might be the better word for it. At almost every point in the game, I found that I had this inherent trust, this unshakable belief that the people at From Software had made the next encounter beatable. Why? Well, it wasn't until I played through Dark Souls 2 and saw how not to instill that same sense of fairness in the encounters and trust in the player that I was able to fully put into words how they did it. Dark Souls is consistent. Unlike its sequel, the hitboxes on attacks are tight, and the moves that enemies have access to make sense alongside their comrades. The first hollows you encounter have slow, tired swings with short swords, but also have a frenzied, leaping attack that they can throw into the mix. Hollow warriors are a bit more mobile, can also carry axes and throw firebombs at you. The more heavily armoured hollow soldiers carry shields, can wield lances, and switch to a crossbow for long-range engagements. All of them feel connected to each other and the world around them, like some long-lost army that once failed at defending the city from the encroaching darkness, in an age long past. The world has strict rules of what enemies are capable of, and the fact that the game follows those rules so closely builds the player's trust in it. What this strong enemy archetyping enables is actually pretty rare in video games as a whole. You are encouraged to learn each enemy completely, how they move about and what their attacks look like, because that information is useful far beyond the few times you might encounter that creature. Somewhere around the middle of the game, you might notice that you can intuit how a new enemy moves and attacks within your first few encounters with them. You already seem to know what to expect from them even before they raise their weapon. This is because you are drawing on what you remember about similar enemies that you fought before, and applying that knowledge against this new foe. Essentially, because the game is so consistent with how different types of enemies should attack and fight, you can rely on the knowledge you've gained from earlier encounters and continue to make use of it. For example, each attack that an enemy can do has a certain wind-up before the damage is dealt, an animation that is unique to that move, with similar enemies like the Boulder Knights and Hollow Soldiers bringing their own variations on that wind-up for their shared attacks. The Hollow Thieves in Lower Undeadburg raise their knife when they're ready to parry you, just like the rapier-wielding Boulder Knights in the parish above. Dark Souls is very deliberate about ensuring that there are no instantaneous, unreadable sources of damage that can occur within a fight. Every item use, dodge move, and follow-up attack has a delay, which enables the player to recognize and react to whatever an opponent may be doing. This methodical, intentional approach to combat is the main reason that I maintain that Dark Souls combat is fair. Difficult, but fair. The game isn't trying to trick you by mixing up the wind-up for attacks to keep you guessing. Nor does it put you in a situation where you will definitely die the first time around and then never die to it again, with the only two notable exceptions to this rule being Mimics and Seath the Scaleless. One of these works, the other, not so much. Enemies are designed to be challenging, but they're also designed with weaknesses, a mixture of slow and fast attacks to make sure that players respect what they can do, while also having their own chances to fight back. Even the most frustratingly difficult creatures that the game has to offer, which for my money happens to be the giant bone dog skeleton things that lurk in the Tomb of Giants, have this too. The aforementioned bony beasts can lunge forward at a moment's notice, but also sluggishly lumber about between attacks, and have a long multi-bite move that leaves them open to a lot of damage if you're able to avoid it. They still suck to fight though. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe that title belongs to the bloody bone wheel skeletons. Those things are a lore unto themselves, and I hate them with every single fiber of my being. But Dark Souls is also honest about its expectations of the player. While there are some deceptive traps, such as the Mimics, or convoluted puzzles like having to cripple Calamite before you can actually fight him. Overall, it is set up as a series of honest challenges, where the rules are clearly showcased up front. Navigate the maze that is Blighttown and learn to deal with poison and toxin as mechanics. Work your way through Sen's fortress and mitigate these environmental hazards and traps. Learn the claustrophobic caverns of the catacombs and find a way through them. Even in these more difficult areas, their mechanics are shown fairly early on, and there's no attempt made to disguise them. The game is upfront with the challenge that these regions are supposed to pose, and then leaves you to figure out a way past them. On top of both of these things, combat is given a lot of weight due to its methodical and tactical nature. With how punishing even a single mistake can be, an encounter with any enemy can become incredibly tense. Knowing that if you die, you'll have to fight your way back to that same spot to retrieve your lost souls, and also that a death without having retrieved them means that they are gone forever, can make even the most rudimentary huddle of enemies a formidable challenge. This means that you can't ever really rest on your laurels. You're constantly being asked to take each enemy that appears in front of you as seriously as the next boss. Another factor that makes combat more significant is the emphasis on the player's personal mastery of the game's mechanics, over leveling up the character's stats. While stat increases do help, at the end of the game your character can do a bit more damage, survive a few more hits, and last a little longer in combat before running out of stamina than they could when they first arrived at Firelink. Far more important is your weapon of choice, how competent you are wielding it, and how confident you feel against your opponent. You can complete the entire game without leveling once if you're good enough. You could even do it using only your starting gear, although you'd be in for some pretty tedious boss fights towards the end. However, the same tactical maneuvering that gives combat that back and forth momentum, the flow of move and counter move, also makes group fights an absolute nightmare. This system was almost certainly developed with one-on-one duels in mind, because it's those fights that stayed with me as the most enjoyable in the game, the most notable of which was against Artorias of the Abyss, who might happen to be my favourite boss. My least favourite boss? Capra Demon. The tight quarters, awful camera angles and tag teaming dogs makes winning that fight the equivalent of a coin toss. There are some things you can do to try to even the odds against multiple enemies. Slow, sweeping swings with two-handed swords, a more defensive stance with a lance and shield, trying to pick enemies off from afar with bows and bombs. These work, but are typically too cumbersome to use regularly, especially with how much health some later enemies have. Ultimately, you end up settling on some variant of what I mentioned earlier, trying to focus down one enemy at a time, dashing in for a few quick hits, before dodging away like a lunatic or turtling up and hoping for the best. Effectively, your only option is to break the multiple enemy encounter back down into separate 1v1 engagements. There's one more aspect to combat that bears mentioning, and I imagine those of you who have played the game a few times have been starting to wonder if I'd forgotten about it entirely. Magic completely and utterly breaks combat in Dark Souls. The entire combat framework that we've been praising up to now is constantly pushing you to handle many different enemies in close quarters, within range of their attacks. Learning their moves and how they fight, working hard to keep yourself from getting cornered with no way out. This is where the difficulty is found, in these battles and the moment-to-moment decisions that you have to make on the fly to avoid getting heavily punished by the game's army of powerful demons and nimble undead. Or you can stand on the other side of the world and snipe them with magic. Don't get me wrong, there was some attempt made to dampen the super effectiveness of magic. You can only equip so many spells at once, and each spell has a limited number of uses before you have to refresh them at a bonfire, but you quickly realize that this is not enough. Not even laughably close to enough. One of the ways that the game enforces the difficulty in combat is by limiting the amount of mistakes you can make in a level, primarily by only allowing you to heal a certain number of times between bonfires. Normally, you can use the Estus Flask 5 times throughout the level, and at certain bonfires, or if you spend a humanity, this is increased to 10. Towards the end of the game, this limit is even pushed to 15, but I for one never really utilized that extra headroom all that much. With how expensive each kindling is, requiring one of your precious humanities for each level of it, and the fact that it's only applied to that specific bonfire, I just couldn't bring myself to push past the 10 Estus mark all that often. This is part of what makes defeating bosses such a monumental feat, because you didn't just defeat them in one attempt, you also overcame their army of minions that guard the path up to them as well. You understood these groups of enemies enough to be able to take as few hits as possible, and get to the boss with enough Estus to overcome them. You don't just get to claim victory over a powerful opponent, you also get to claim it over that area of the game. Unless you've put points into Faith, that is. Then you can have 5 extra small heals, 3 extra heals that recover over half of your HP, 2 uses of a spell that slowly regenerates your health over time, or any combination of these. Suddenly, you don't need to learn the enemies as thoroughly or be as precise with your attacks because you can make so many more mistakes and still have the healing to compensate for them. Healing with any of these spells is a lot slower than using an Estus, for sure, but I was more than capable of casting them during combat, and even having the ability to top yourself off between encounters is a massive benefit, allowing you to save the faster use Estus for the boss to come. And this is probably the tamest example of how magic breaks combat in Dark Souls. There are orbs of light that hover around the player and automatically seek out enemies. Fireballs that explode, damaging large groups, pillars of flame that engulf multiple foes, giant spears that skewer opponents. You can have all of these equipped at the same time if you have enough points in attunement. I didn't fully understand just how powerful magic was until I did a separate playthrough focusing on it. And having done so, I'm surprised it's not talked about more often. It transforms Dark Souls from an action-adventure game fraught with lethal perils and challenging foes into a shooting gallery where none of your enemies can shoot back. It's as if you're the jerk who brought the paintball gun to your local LARP meetup. Oh, and the gun basically has infinite ammo. Genuinely, it trivializes nearly every encounter in the game. Yes, even the DLC bosses, and I really don't understand how it makes sense alongside this combat system. It is, in almost every sense, truly broken. And yet, it's not the only issue that lurks within Dark Souls. So, brace yourselves, because now we turn away from the triumphs, and towards the flaws that are buried beneath them. Here is where critiquing Dark Souls gets murky, as a lot of what makes it an iconic game that stands the test of time is also, at least in part, what lets it down today. Let me ask you a question. When you think about all the areas of Lordran, of all the myriad regions you travel through, which would you say stand out in your mind? Which left such a strong impression that you'd feel somewhat confident in your abilities if you were, say, tasked with running through it blindfolded? Undead Burg, New Londo Ruins, Blighttown, Darkroot Forest, Anor Londo? Basically, which do you immediately think of when I say Dark Souls? With the possible exception of the DLC areas, which are technically only accessible later in the game, I'm willing to bet you're thinking of a place from the first half, up to and including Anor Londo, as opposed to the second. And I've got a couple of important reasons for that. The first and most obvious of which is that these areas serve as your introduction to the world of Dark Souls, and a trial by fire for the combat system. You're learning a lot more about the different enemies, how to fight them, and the characters and scenery around you in the first half of the game than you are in the later sections. The first time you parry and follow up with the riposte, the first time you die to fall damage, get demolished by a group of enemies, take no damage during an encounter, these moments stay with you throughout your time with the game. There's a reason that one of the most revered bosses in Dark Souls are the Bell Gargoyles, as they represent the first major difficulty spike that players have to overcome. And finally slaying them is definitely one of the highlights of my playthrough.
Oh god. I forgot to breathe.
The second reason is a little more complicated. Throughout the first half of Dark Souls, the game operates on a completely unspoken but incredibly important premise. If you can see it, you can reach it. Without even realizing it, from your starting point at Firelink, you can see up to the aqueduct that you use to get into the town, the rampart where you fight the Taurus demon, and even the bridge where you get toasted by the red dragon. These blurry, faint objects in the distance are real, reachable areas that you can explore and fight within, and the scale is accurate. When you are standing on the ramparts, you can look back down and see just how much progress you've made, how far you have actually traveled. Deeproot Forest stands stoically beneath you on one side, while the streets of Undeadburg sprawl on the other, and the parish and its chapel stand overhead, giving you your next landmark, your next objective to head towards. And all the while, as you are fighting your way through the first half of the game, dying in Sen's Fortress and falling through Blighttown, Anor Londo looms above. But that all stops when you reach that lofty keep and slay the deadly duo within. The open world sweeping landscapes, locations weaving between each other naturally and effortlessly, are all cast aside as you set off down one of 4 long corridors to fight the Lords. What changed? Well, once you complete Anor Londo, you are given the Lord Vessel, and, far more importantly, the ability to fast travel between certain bonfires. Now, I do want to acknowledge that this ability is absolutely necessary to have in the game, and unlocking it here is certainly the best place for it. At this point in your travels, the world you can explore has grown to gargantuan proportions. And if the game actually expected you to walk from Anor Londo's cathedral, back through Sen's fortress, through the Undead Parish and into Firelink, place the Lord Vessel and then backtrack all the way back up to Anor Londo to the now open pathway into the Duke's Archives, well, then this section would be called Dark Souls: The Original Strand type game. Thankfully, it isn't. However, up until Anor Londo, you are constantly moving from one location to another, circling back to where you used to be and building your knowledge of the intricate landscape around you. The end of one area would typically loop back into an area you've seen before, or feed directly into another new zone, with myriad more paths for you to explore. But once you complete Anor Londo and unlock that useful fast travel technique, the need for the paths you take to loop back on themselves, to have shortcuts and landmarks, to create interesting layouts, and even make sense geographically, completely evaporates. Now, once you reach the end of a path you've been exploring, it just ends, stops dead in its tracks, and you simply warp back to Firelink and start again. It's not just that the player is no longer required to learn the environments around them to understand where they are in the world and where they're trying to get to. It's that From Software didn't need to do that anymore either. While the beginning of the game is this fantastic open environment that you're encouraged to adventure within and become familiar with, the second half is a series of mostly linear corridors that you walk along until you kill the Lord at the end. Rinse, repeat. In fact, a lot of elements that were well executed begin to falter in the second half of the game, and nowhere is this more noticeable than Lost Izalith. The scene was set for some very cool things. A winding cavern that seems to open up onto hell itself, large, unsightly demons lurking in the lava. You scale some crumbling ruins, wondering what civilization could possibly have thrived here to build them, tackle a hulking beast that resided in the magma, and then you see it. Initially recoiling in horror, you find your composure long enough to ask aloud, did they just copy-paste a bunch of the early game bosses in a row? Yes, they did. They didn't even change their orientation or default pose or even space them out a little bit, they just pasted them all there and called it a day. I mean, look at them. Control-C, Control-V. It's a well-known fact that this part of the game was incredibly rushed during its initial release. Even without the lead designer of Dark Souls, Hidetaka Miyazaki, confirming as much in interviews, the evidence is everywhere. From the reused assets, inescapable route systems, and uninspired animationless enemies, Lost Izalith is easily the most disappointing, lackluster area in Dark Souls 1. I mean, just look at the array of enemies you fight here. The majority of your time will be spent slaying wave upon wave of these stoic, expressionless statues that just seem to hover their way around, fire spewing from their unmoving faces. The carrion worms are somewhat interesting, but also seem like they belong in a different game. Having an enemy that cannot move at all is basically asking the player to cheese them with arrows and magic, especially since they move so erratically when you are in range of their attacks. And when you aren't fighting earlier bosses masquerading as regular enemies, you're fighting a lazy palette swap of the very first boss you ever encountered, the Asylum Demon, as one of this area's main attractions. And who could forget the infamous Bed of Chaos? Where to begin with this one? I feel like a lot has been said about this boss in particular, so I'll just say this. What frustrates me most about the Bed of Chaos is the potential it had as an enemy. While a puzzle-based fight feels like quite the departure from the Dark Souls we've enjoyed up to now, the systems act largely the same. You have to take time to understand what it's capable of, how it operates, and what weak points it may have that you can use to your advantage. This could have been an interesting encounter, somewhat in the vein of the Four Kings, where there are multiple stages to overcome before the boss finally falls, which is somewhat close to how the fight operates currently. You have to reach both sides of the main tree to destroy the barriers, then make your way into the center of the tree and kill the woodlouse that resides there. With a little more work, this idea could have been brilliant. Maybe instead of just walking over and hitting a piece of wood to break the barrier, there could have been a mini-boss guardian or somewhat difficult enemy there in its stead that you have to overcome. Or maybe the boss itself could create projectiles for you to block and evade, and fodder enemies to contend with, as opposed to just flailing around with up to 4 almost undodgeable arms. It could have been a creative and unique entry into the pantheon of great bosses that this game has to offer. But as it stands, this fight is a largely unfair and tedious form of trial and error. Don't know exactly where the floor falls out as you walk over it and which places remain stable? You died. Didn't realize the hitbox on the boss's hand is larger than the actual hand itself? You died. Dodged the first hand, but also didn't notice that the arm, while doing no damage, can push you around mid-roll into a hole in the floor? You died. There's no real rhythm to the boss's moves that you need to identify, and nothing interesting that you can do on your end either. Just try, fail, try again, and keep doing that until you finally luck your way to the finish. I think it says something about the Bed of Chaos that this is the only boss fight in the entire game that persists after death. That this is the only named enemy with a health bar that you are not expected to defeat in one attempt. Your progress is maintained between lives. You can break one of the barriers and immediately fall to your death, but the barrier will remain broken forever. This encounter is clearly not fully realized, not completed, but is also necessary to the second half of the game, as it provides one of the ephemeral Lord souls that the Lord Vessel requires, so it cannot be taken out either. So it's stuck, unable to be removed, but completely unfair to ask someone to defeat it in one attempt. So the rules were bent to accommodate it. It's just a shame that they didn't use the remaster as an opportunity to complete this clearly incomplete boss. To show us what they had reluctantly had to remove from the game, how much better this fractured area could have been if they'd had the time they needed to completely explore this idea of a hellish, sunken ruin and the fires of ambition that laid it to waste. As it is, the Bed of Chaos does manage to act as the perfect conclusion to Lost Izalith. A tedious slog through a half-realized idea that never really knows what it is trying to do or how it is trying to do it. Yet it is not the only example where Dark Souls misses the mark with its bosses. As early as the Taurus demon, cracks begin to show. The game frequently makes use of interesting terrain to navigate and fight within, forcing you to deal with your enemies on narrow ledges, bridges, and pathways at various points throughout the game. An encounter with a lance-wielding hollow soldier is that much harder when you risk rolling into the abyss to avoid an attack. At the same time, it can also be quite empowering when you work out a way to force them off the edge with a swift kick to the shield. This same environmental hazard was put to use in the arena for the Taurus demon. The ancient parapet giving way on one side, leaving a sizable gap for the player to accidentally fall through during the close quarters melee against the enormous boss. A far cry from the wide, walled-in arena of the Asylum Demon, this fight tests your spatial awareness on all fronts. Watching your distance from the demon and his enormous club, the location of the gap in the parapet, how close you are to getting trapped up against one of the towers. A single slip-up can send you tumbling off the edge to your demise, or see you getting crushed by a swift and heavy swing from the demon. This is a great fight, and I found it to be a really enjoyable challenge upon my first playthrough. The close quarters and large, sweeping attacks forced me to react and adapt faster to this formidable opponent. However, on my second playthrough, the boss, the capstone for Undead Burg, the gatekeeper of Undead Parish and the rest of the game, jumped backwards off the edge and died. And while it's always funny when a regular enemy oopsies their way into oblivion, it is significantly less so when the boss you've spent multiple lives improving your strategy against robs you of the satisfaction of actually beating it. A similar thing happened on my first playthrough of the game just around the corner from here. The Hellkite Wyvern that guarded the bridge into Undead Parish started to not know where it was.
What?
It began walking through the castle, teleporting around a bit, jumping up to its perch and down to the bridge, and finally into the wall, before falling through the terrain and dying. The game's refusal to let me load an earlier save, it continually overwrites the save game, so there are no earlier saves you can go back to undo this, meant that I never got to experience that optional but interesting mini-boss. In fact, of the game's 26 bosses, 7 of them do not live up to their peers, and I'll quickly run through my problems with the rest. As I previously mentioned, the Capra Demon might be my least favourite boss in the game, and not because of anything he necessarily does. The arena for this fight is tiny, cramped, and claustrophobic. Or at least, I think it was, because the camera spent so long wedged behind some vines or in the wall, I don't think I ever saw the whole thing for more than a few seconds. Add in the random attack dogs that are also shoved inside this shoebox of an arena, and you can see why many people find this fight to be a test of your patience and luck, more than your actual skill. Of course, the other 2 bosses of Lost Izalith also deserve mention here. One is a Pokemon-styled palette swap of the Asylum Demon you fought at the beginning of the game. The 3rd time they used that boss in the game, by the way, and is just as easy to dispatch. The other is a weird centipede, Cerberus, dragon thing that just doesn't work on any level. It doesn't come off as threatening at all. In fact, it's almost comical. The only attacks it has consist of wildly flailing with one of its arms and throwing lava balls at you. It's so out of place you'd think George Lucas had digitally inserted it for the remaster.
Someone was in the pod.
Pinwheel is funny, I guess. During my first playthrough, Twitch chat really had me believing that I was walking right into another Ornstein and Smo encounter deep in the catacombs. Of course, I wasn't, and I honestly felt kind of cheated in a weird way. I had come to associate the bosses of Dark Souls with a feeling of accomplishment, as they marked your conquering of not only a difficult enemy, but a large area of the game as well. Each had felt like a capstone, the fulfilling end to one part of your journey, and the start of the next. But I left the encounter with Pinwheel chuckling a little, and also feeling deeply unsatisfied. Nito, however, is a pretty neat fight. Sorry, couldn't help myself. His attacks are varied, his design is incredible. He was the main character from the opening cinematic that really drew me in, and I mean, look at him. His arena is pretty cool too, but his merry marching skeleton band cannot be permanently killed except with holy damage, which is a cheap and boring way to make this fight considerably harder. Don't get me wrong, I like the concept on display here, the idea that Nito commands endless hordes of undead, and that trying to fight them is akin to stopping the tide. But having that essentially tied to an on-off switch, whether you have access to holy damage or not, is frankly lame. If they'd expanded upon this idea into an actual mechanic, maybe by having the skeletons take longer and longer to revive each time you kill them, or by having Nito become staggered briefly while the band takes a short dirt nap, maybe losing access to his more powerful attacks, it could have added a lot to this fight beyond a flat difficulty buff. As it is, these backing dancers end up being where 90% of the challenge can be found. With them alive, the fight is tedious, repetitive, and exhausting. Once they're permanently dead, the Gravelord himself is really not all that difficult to handle. Manus is actually a boss I really enjoyed. They leaned into the Four Kings Abyss aesthetic and built upon it quite well. He fights ferociously, using a giant catalyst as a club and casting dark magic, presenting quite the intimidating end cap to the game. But as you might have guessed from my earlier sentiments, it's his magic that I have a problem with. The Dark Wave and Dark Rain attacks are difficult to manage, requiring lightning reflexes and good timing, which I'm fine with. It's the final boss of the DLC, and therefore technically the game. You could argue it's Calamite, but I digress. It shouldn't be easy. However, the Dark Circle attack is a different beast entirely. Manus creates orbs around the outside of the arena and then pulls them into the center, the spacing and speed of which makes dodging them reliably basically impossible. I tried for hours to find a consistent method to block and or dodge this attack, and I couldn't. Upon looking online, the only way to avoid it consistently is to actually cheese it. Run straight at Manus because the spell actually fades out just before it hits him. Now, you could argue it's down to skill. I can already hear the chorus of "Get Good" drifting along on the wind outside, but I'd argue that that isn't actually the case here, because From Software actually put in an item that deflects all of Manus's magic. In fact, it deflects all dark magic in its entirety. All of it. I would think my issues with this should be obvious, but in case they aren't, let me put it like this. Instead of fine-tuning the Dark Circle attack, taking the time to test different variations, finding that equilibrium between damage and speed, between difficult and impossible like they were able to do with so many other bosses, including Artorias of the Abyss in the same DLC, they just realized the magic would hit players for massive, oftentimes fatal damage almost every single time as it's implemented currently. And so they put in a hard counter to compensate. Similar to killing Nito's magical skeleton band, once you have this amulet, the fight becomes almost trivial. Do I have to use the amulet? Not necessarily, no, but why put something in that completely humbles any boss in your game that makes such a big deal of overcoming these towering titans? The fact that this amulet exists shows that, at least to some extent, they couldn't figure out how to make this boss work the way they wanted to. And instead of taking the time to puzzle their way through this issue, they just threw this item in and called it a day. It comes off as lazy, rushed, which is a shame, because other than this, I loved Manus as a boss. Oh, and finally Seath the Scaleless forces you to die once before you can actually fight him for real. With how punishing death is in this game, I'd call that a very cheap shot. And for all the lead up to the rematch, the second encounter is pretty dull. Break the crystal, stay beside him, and peck away until dead. Nothing much else to say about this fairly boring boss. In fact, now that I'm writing this out, I'm realizing that the only one of the four lords that is actually worth fighting is the Four Kings. Their arena is confusing as hell, but I personally enjoyed that aspect and the fight itself a lot. It was unique, challenging, and interesting in a way that none of the other lords managed to be. Which again is why I'm firmly of the opinion that Dark Souls is a game of two halves. Before you complete Anor Londo, and after. The good and the not so good. Speaking of which, I already know this opinion is going to be somewhat divisive, but I'm fairly certain I can back this up with evidence, so here goes. I do not understand why this game has any online content at all, as it is fundamentally at odds with the rest of the game. Player messages, summons and bloodstains, PvP invasions, heck, I'll even throw the NPC invasions in here too, honestly. None of them play into the game's strengths. To me, it all feels like a relatively pointless addition to an already great game, with the only payoffs being that they can artificially increase the difficulty in certain areas and get to print network features on the back of the box. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, onto... Alright, let's actually examine this a bit, starting with what I consider to be the lesser of the two evils. NPC invasions feel completely out of place in the game the way they are implemented currently, despite the efforts to explain them in the lore through the questline involving Lautrec of Kareem and the Firelink Shrine Firekeeper. The world building I praised previously, filling each region with enemies that actually feel like they belong there, is significantly impacted when the screen flashes with "You've been invaded by so-and-so," and then a glowing red figure waltzes around the corner. Having all of these invaders look exactly alike, all sporting this bright red Instagram filter regardless of where they show up in the game, makes them feel like what they are. An effort to add interesting enemies throughout the world without taking the time to have them make sense within it. I feel like it's important for me to say that I actually enjoyed fighting these invaders. They are genuinely difficult in a lot of interesting ways, each one posing a different but specific challenge. How do you handle an enemy that has much longer reach than you do, much more powerful attacks, but is slower? How do you handle an enemy with a badass crossbow thing and agile reflexes? These one-off encounters function like mini-bosses and are genuinely really enjoyable to fight. However, I also can't ignore that a first playthrough of the game is actually hampered by having these invasions. They add what feels like an artificial difficulty spike to the areas they do show up in, as the level was clearly designed to be completed without them in it, since they don't even appear if you have not maintained your humanity up to that point. This could have been fixed with one simple change. Only allow NPC invasions in New Game Plus. This allows your first playthrough to be the well-tailored, concise adventure that it was clearly built to be, and also allows the invasion mechanic to fulfill the role it was designed for, providing an interesting system that adds a huge amount of variety and additional challenge to a second playthrough for those that want it. Suddenly, New Game Plus isn't just a damage and stat buff to enemies across the board. It has also been given these unique, but definitely out of place, additions to the battalions that inhabit Lordran. Your knowledge of the world from your first playthrough isn't as trustworthy anymore. You have new information to learn about areas you've previously mastered, as these enemies could appear at any time and from anywhere. Alternatively, if this idea doesn't appeal to you, I have another one that could also work. Or, more accurately, Darkroot Garden does. Just remove the bloody red filter that these enemies have and treat them as a part of the world. Make them actual people that have gone hollow and lost their senses that you then have to dispatch. Let their presence actually add something to the environments they show up in, add to the atmosphere of death and decay that the game so painstakingly crafts throughout its runtime, instead of taking away from it. It always struck me as strange that there seemed to be only 2 stages to the undead curse that you deal with in Dark Souls. Those that still had their wits about them and then subsequently lost their humanity through the course of your time with the game, and those that lost their minds a long, long time ago and now shamble through the streets as shriveled husks of their former selves. Having some other undead that clearly went hollow somewhat recently, but that weren't the ancient, withered corpses that litter Lordran, would add a lot to the world they inhabit. It would work alongside the NPCs that also go hollow during their quest lines, like Big Hat Logan or the Crestfallen Warrior, building on the premise that this is a realm that is still actively decaying as you're adventuring through it. That there are other people outside of the small circle of friends that you make that have been lost to the curse, and that without your help, the NPCs that you rescue would also be doomed to that fate. I do genuinely appreciate and enjoy the technical challenge that these NPC invaders bring to the game. I just wish it was not at the expense of the narrative and the world building around them. Now on to the online aspects of the game. PvP, the bloodstains, player messages, summons, and ghosts. I will happily admit that they are all interesting ideas on their own, and a few of them do help to build a feeling of community. That there are many people that have also struggled through their time in Lordran, as every player that embarks on their quest as the chosen undead leaves behind evidence of their existence for future adventurers to find. Seeing the final moments of other undead who died on their journey, hearing the bells of awakening tolling in the distance with every successful adventurer that reaches them, having the ghostly figure of a fellow player appear when you both rest at the same bonfire. These things breathe a surprising amount of life into the atmosphere of Lordran, making the world appear markedly less empty. And it is somewhat reassuring to feel that you are not facing this Herculean task alone. PvP, however, wasn't really something I ever interacted with, as by the time I had begun my adventure, the player base had largely moved on to Dark Souls 3, so I never really got the chance to see that side of the game. But, considering all the downsides that NPC invasions bring, not to mention the additional issues that a multiplayer matchmaking system would have in a game where you mostly fight AI, I can't imagine my experience was hampered by missing out on that aspect of online play. If anything, it was probably improved by its absence. I did see plenty of player messages though, short sentences left by other adventurers, or included in the game by From Software themselves, that litter the world of Lordran. While these glowing tweets from the Netherrealms can be interesting, you can probably already guess my thoughts on them. They take away from your ability to explore, sometimes straight up spoiling hidden walls, chest locations, and area mechanics. And that's not just restricted to online messages from other players either. There's even this developer message that was placed right on top of an invisible walkway in Crystal Cave. There's already a ton of environmental hints that allowed people to figure this out on their own. This alcove with multiple shards shattering in thin air originally tipped me off to this mechanic. I find it incredibly strange that a game that puts so much emphasis on players having to figure things out on their own would then resort to this kind of hand-holding. But, as I mentioned earlier, I never really took part in PvP or used summons much myself. Largely because I found the random ghosts walking around so distracting, the PvP scene largely non-existent, and the player messages so full of spoilers that I just played the game offline. But that's also kind of my point. This is my opinion, of course, but these systems largely come across as superfluous additions to an already complete experience. Nice to have for those that use them, but not necessary at all to enjoy the game for what it is. A fantastic, challenging adventure through a decaying land, filled with wondrous sights and chilling monsters. With that out of the way, for real this time, allow me to talk about my last major issue with the game that seems to get swept under the rug a lot.
In the age of ancients.
Some years ago, back at the start of this video, I stated that I wasn't going to talk about world design that much because it was a largely convoluted and fractured part of the game that only really comes through strongly in its environmental storytelling and NPC interactions.
Of Lord Gwyn to seek my very own son. Do you find that strange? Well, you should.
Okay, maybe I didn't put it quite like that, but I think it's a fair point to make. As I said before, the lore and story of the game are vague and obfuscated, hidden behind the many cryptic dialogues of the NPCs that you find, buried beneath the mountains of item descriptions.
There are actually 2 bells of awakening.
While this does a decent job of creating a backdrop in which to enjoy the world around you, if at any point you are required to have a more than surface level understanding of how that world operates in order to progress, it fundamentally cannot facilitate that. One example of this would be after you've rung the first bell of awakening in Undead Parish. You're left at the top of a bell tower, with no real instructions on where to go next, beyond the vague musings of the crestfallen warrior that greeted you when you first arrived at Firelink. One above,
the other is
one
far,
below.
far below.
As it turns out, you need to backtrack to the Red Wyvern's Bridge, where you'll realize that along the way, you've picked up a basement key on the steps of the parish chapel. Said key opens this nondescript door on one part of the battlements, that you may note is 100% definitely not a basement. Nor does it lead to a basement, it actually leads you to Lower Undeadburg, the undercity where you can fight backflipping assassins, hordes of rabid dogs, and the Capra demon. Once he's finally slain, dislodge your camera from the nearby brickwork, head down the staircase next to his boss arena, and use the key you just got from him to open the way to the depths. Now, the description of the basement key does point you to the door on the bridge, which is something, but if I hadn't been streaming this game for my first playthrough, there was about a 0% chance that I would have figured out where I needed to go, having rung the first bell. My initial thoughts were heading through Andre's smithy into Deeproot Garden, or going back to Firelink and starting out on a different path from there, maybe through the graveyard or, heaven forbid, New Londo ruins. While this might not seem like a big deal to those of us who have already completed this game once, twice, 5 times, think back to your first playthrough for a moment. When you didn't have the layouts to most of these areas mapped into your psyche, and you had no idea this guy was actually called Oscar of Astora. Back when the furtive pygmy was still so easily forgotten. Getting irrecoverably lost has almost certainly ended some people's interest in the Dark Souls series before it could even get started. For example, let's re-examine the multitude of options that are available to you having rung the Bell of Awakening in Undead Parish. You have the Graveyard and New Londo ruins lurking near Firelink, Deeproot Garden, which if you're very thorough in your exploration, will actually put you on a much easier path into Blighttown, and the actual path you're quote-unquote supposed to take at this point, which leads you into Lower Undeadburg, and then the Depths, and then Blighttown. Since the game basically pushes you back to Firelink after you've defeated the Bell Gargoyles, since it's the closest bonfire you can use to spend all those delicious souls you just earned, the Graveyard seems like the next best path to take. And unlike Darkroot Garden, that is essentially a self-contained side area that can fortunately also lead to Blighttown, or New Londo Ruins, where you have invulnerable enemies to maybe inform you that you might be heading in the wrong direction, you could easily trek all the way through the Graveyard, through the labyrinthine catacombs beneath them, and even to the bottom of the Tomb of Giants, before you realize you've made a terrible mistake. Not helping matters is the fact that Dark Souls is worshipped for being unapologetically difficult and never going easy on you, which makes it so much harder to figure out whether the game is trying to send you a message or not.
That's what I figured.
This was why I spent so much time trying to fight my way through the Graveyard during my first playthrough of the game, before I'd even set foot in Undeadburg.
Can I run? I was really trying to run.
I had missed the path up to the aqueduct and just assumed that the escalation from the flimsy hollows I had been dealing with to these much tougher, faster skeletons I was finding was a reasonable uptick in difficulty for this infamously difficult series.
God damn it.
So having just defeated one of the more challenging bosses compared to the enemies that they are surrounded by, the Graveyard and the Catacombs beyond don't seem that much more difficult in comparison. If this was a Bethesda game, I could definitely see that little pop-up appearing here saying, "Congratulations on completing the tutorial." This is where the real Dark Souls begins. Would you like to modify your character before setting off into the wider Lordland? I mean, are they trying to ward you off by filling these burial chambers with tougher enemies that endlessly resurrect unless you've dealt with their nearby necromancer? Or have you just not gotten good enough yet? Follow that up with the laughably easy pinwheel at the end of this path, and you'd be forgiven for believing that you are actually heading in the right direction, leading you to stumble blindly through the Tomb of Giants for hours upon hours, only to find a glowing yellow barrier at the end of it all, that says, "Nope, you guessed wrong. Better luck next time." And then you're left with no other choice than to turn around and march all the way back up to Firelink to try again. If something like this happened to you during your first playthrough of the game, let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how commonplace it was to end up overcommitting to the wrong path and burning hours of effort on what effectively amounts to a dead end. Was it demoralizing to the point that you just stopped playing the game? Or did you also chalk it up to the famed Souls-like difficulty and soldier on? If you did quit, did you ever end up coming back for a second attempt? I was lucky enough to stream my first playthrough, so I had chat to guide me, mainly with comments like, "He's so blind,"
I am blind.
or "Can't wait till he figures out how wrong he is, lol." But if I hadn't had chat, I'm fairly certain I would have stubbornly continued through the graveyard and beyond until I bounced off of that self-same golden gate and promptly uninstalled the game. So, thanks, chat. This is by far not the only time that this kind of confusion arises, where you aren't quite sure what the game is actually asking of you. There's a similar moment in Anor Londo, for example, where you reach the end of a bridge and see the central cathedral towering on the other side. It's pretty clear that you want to get to that monumental structure. But how? I looked around here for ages for an alternate path, another elevator, a working lever to lower the bridge back into position. But as it turns out, I needed to drop onto this buttress and use it to scale my way into the neighbouring cathedral. I'm sure there are people watching to whom this was incredibly obvious, but I'm also willing to bet I'm not the only one who got stuck here, because it breaks the game's own rules about what you can and cannot interact with. Take the seemingly easy jump in Undeadburg, for example. Although you would reasonably assume that you could just hop over this short gap to the other side, you actually have to find a way onto the roof of this building before you're able to Mario your way over there. What about this cliff face that looks like it could lead to untold secrets and hidden riches? Nope. You died. Yet jumping off this elevator and Skyrim platforming your way up to a bird's nest to take you back to Undead Asylum, that's fine. There's an infuriating inconsistency to when and where the game allows you to push outside of its typical boundaries, that you inevitably stop trying to find them. Deaths are too punishing and the rules applied too loosely to encourage this kind of experimentation. The most egregious example of this disconnect between gameplay and world building, though, is found in New Londo Ruins. Imagine, if you will, that you have fought your way through this hellish, flooded nightmare, contended with ghosts in the walls, dark wraiths hounding your every step, and whatever the hell this is. And then you find it. A really long spiral staircase behind a fog door. You begin to descend, weapon ready. You've used a tightly wound staircase before, and it did not end well. Tension coils within you, winding deeper and tighter with each step. The staircase ends. This must be something, you think to yourself. This apprehension, this build-up could not be for nothing. A deep breath. You step off the edge. Huh. I guess I was wrong. Time to keep exploring the ruins. You can see the problem here, right? Other than the fog door and the abnormal length of the staircase behind it, there's no indication that this is the entrance to the Lord's boss arena for this region, or that you need to fulfill an incredibly specific prerequisite, defeating a whole other boss to obtain Artorias' ring, and then making sure it's equipped before you drop down, to gain access to it. It reads more as an entrance to an optional boss that you come back for once you're done with the game, or a super secret loot area that needs extremely specific directions to get into, not your entire purpose for going to New Londo Ruins in the first place. And it's a shame, really, because the reasons behind why you need to obtain and wear this ring, and the significance to both the DLC and the Sif and Artorias boss fights, are genuinely very interesting. But it's so far removed from the actual game that this only really comes across as an annoying gatekeeping technique. Make sure you've completed Darkroot Garden before you head to New Londo Ruins. LOL. And look, I'm sure that the rest of the Dark Souls story and lore is as breathtaking and uniquely interesting as the environments it's set in and the characters that live within them.
Yeah, wonderful.
But if the game isn't going to attempt to present it to me in an interesting way, or even try to present it to me at all, then I'm not going to go digging for it. And I'm fairly certain most won't either.
I'm afraid I don't see anything here.
I admire the reasoning behind why Hidetaka Miyazaki and the team at From Software presented the lore in this way. He himself has mentioned in interviews that he wanted to see players working together to theorycraft and understand the world around them as they're playing, imagining this large, collaborative effort that everyone that picked up the game would be a part of. It's actually part of the reason why I maintain that exploration is the core of the game. The point of playing Dark Souls is to adventure in this foreign land, fighting through the remnants of what was once a thriving civilization to determine what really happened to Lordran, how it ended up like this. But, realistically, burying the story to this extent makes it utterly inaccessible for a lot of players. Sure, it allows people the ability to come to their own conclusions on the world, based on the fantastic environmental storytelling and superbly acted NPC dialogues I mentioned earlier, but most will forever miss out on the rich, underlying characters and history contained within. In a strange twist of fate, Dark Souls suffers the same sorry end as the kingdom it tries to portray. Its people, their accomplishments and failings, communities and tales, all fading into obscurity. Beyond the bosses' names, their rotting settlements, and broken inhabitants, players are left with little else to guide them towards understanding the crumbling land they're adventuring in. There is little here for people to uncover, no dangling threads to pull on for those interested in learning more. So they'll only remember Dark Souls as a test of strength, a challenge to be overcome, and will never know how much more there is to the world in which it takes place. They'll remember the bosses and enemies, but won't understand or even have the desire to find out why they are there. It is just a video game, and they were only there to be beaten. From Software made a brilliant game that spawned a unique genre, an extensive series, and launched Hidetaka Miyazaki and his team to stardom. Dark Souls inspired countless others to follow its example, leading the charge into a new era for video games that led to some of the most highly acclaimed creations of our time. However, it is not as perfect as Mythos would lead you to believe, and while the issues are few, they are there, lurking beneath. In the end, Dark Souls manages to be a stroke of genius, a testament to the limitations of its design, and the enormous ambition of the From Software team all at once. While I am not the first to feel confident in proclaiming this game to be a timeless classic, nor will I likely be the last to do so, it is still showing its age. And ultimately, it teaches a lesson that I think we should all try to keep in mind. You can deeply enjoy something great while still recognizing its flaws.
Our Lord hath returned.
Well, that's my first ever critique of a video game. Thank you so much for listening to it all the way through. I really, really appreciate that. It took me way longer to make than I thought it would, but I'm hoping to make this the main objective of this channel going forward. Finally, that new banner makes sense, huh? Reviews, critiques, and of course, coffee. I really enjoyed making this. I feel like I do have something unique to add to the pantheon of voices that are already out there, and I hope you would agree. If you want to share your thoughts or talk more about anything I said in the video, I have a Discord server. The comments on this video work as well. Plus, I stream 3 days a week over on Twitch if you want to catch me live there. I've linked both in the description. Of course, subscribe if you want to stay updated on my next critique. I am open to suggestions in the Discord as to what that will be, and consider giving the video a like as well. It helps more people find the channel and all that good stuff. But for the time being, have a fantastic rest of your day, whatever you may be doing. Stay safe, and I shall see you all next time.